How do family businesses need to transform to survive to the next generation? This is the Leaders of Transformation podcast. And on this show, we interview difference makers and world changers who are disrupting for good. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Nicole Jansen. And on our show today, we're going to be talking with Laurie Barkman. She is a business transition sherpa. Her firm is called SmallDotBig, and she advises owners on having a more valuable, sellable business. She is the former CEO of a $100 million revenue company with an exit to a Fortune 50 company. And with more than 25 years of C-suite and award-winning marketing expertise, she provides actionable perspectives on driving sustainable value. So today, we're going to be talking about succession planning. We're going to be talking about when to sell your business, how to value your business, how to maximize your exit value, and how to ensure that your business actually survives through to the next generation, and what's the transformation that needs to happen. And so I'm really excited to have her here. Laurie, welcome to Leaders Transformation.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm excited to be here with you.
Yes, and very soon we're actually going to turn the tables, and I'll be on Laurie's show, and that's going to be a lot of fun. We'll continue the conversation, so you can stay tuned for that afterwards. A little plug for her podcast, which is Succession Stories Podcast. So check that out if you want to have more information on and learn more about the succession planning and things that she does. Now, before we dive into this conversation, I do want to do a shout out to Laurie Barkman, who is the host of the Talent Grow Show, which is an awesome podcast. I've also been on a guest on her show. She's been a guest on mine. And I don't normally do those interview swaps, only where it makes sense. And it absolutely makes sense with Laurie, and it absolutely made sense with Laurie. And so if you are looking for a leadership development podcast, obviously this is a great show. I believe it's a great show. We've been doing over 400 episodes. We've got a lot of awesome content. Laurie has also fantastic content on her show as well. So I highly recommend it. And one more thing before we go into the conversation, as I said with Laurie, this podcast is actually brought to you by my training and coaching company, which is the Leaders of Transformation. And if you are a leader who wants to be better, do better, make a greater impact in the world, you can schedule a time with me. We can talk about your specific situation, what it's going to take for you to transform and move to the next level. You can go to leadersoftransformation.com/coaching. And it tells you a little bit more about the coaching that I do and see if it's a fit. And you can schedule a time in my calendar to have a conversation. So with that, Laurie, let's dive in and talk about a little bit just to kind of set the stage for this. Succession planning is a very familiar term to you. Some, it may not be as familiar as a term. So maybe explain what it is and why is it such a hot topic right now, and one that we need to address.
Succession is in the media a lot, and it's shows we watch, movies we watch. You've probably heard of Yellowstone with the Dutton family and their generations of landowners. You've probably seen the movie Gucci with some wonderful stars, and the true story about that family and the storied dynasties of even Apple, right? And so Amazon, large companies, everyone at some point is going to leave their company. And what we say is that you'd like to control that situation. You might have a unplanned transition. You might die, right? There might be a divorce in the family. There can be things that are more of a negative association as why someone might leave. But there's also this positive connotation of being excited about moving on to the next thing. So let's talk about succession, maybe just bring it up a notch. I like to talk about it as transition. That's why I call myself a business transition sherpa, because I don't presume to know what their transition's going to be. I like to work with clients on option generation. Let's talk about what the options are. And in that context, it will be always a popular topic because, again, it's going to happen in death and taxes. Succession is going to happen. We will leave our businesses one day. So why not plan for it? Why not be proactive and leave it in the hands of the next gen for taking the business forward?
Yes. And sometimes that next gen is a son, is a daughter, is a combination of family members. Sometimes it's better not to do that and sell it and have somebody who really is passionate, or maybe it's employee, maybe talk about some of those possibilities, and which ones do you find are much more common and much more successful, if there's one that's more successful over the other?
Yeah, we should probably talk about the market dynamics at play, because that's the other thing that's in the news. If you're following the business trends from 2021 was a peak year for private equity investments. And that's probably the first category behind family transitions that we think about when we think about a business changing hands. And if you can envision this baton, now the handoff from the baton going from one to the next, do we drop it? Is there something in between, or is it a smooth, seamless transition? Private equity, there's a lot of dry powder out there. There's a lot of money to be invested, and there's a lot of demand for good quality companies that fit their investment thesis. So we can certainly talk more about that category, which we call generally financial buyers. Private equity groups in general are known to really be looking at the numbers. They don't tend to have management to deploy at their in their investments. So they're looking for different things. They might be looking for what they call a platform, or like an anchor investment. Imagine in the mall, right? The big mall. If it was Macy's, Macy's is like the anchor tenant, and then the other stores are around it. Same idea with a private equity group. When they raise a fund, they raise money to invest, and they're looking for maybe that platform, larger investment, and then follow-on investments, which they call tuck-ins or add-ons. The other category that we've been talking about in terms of options for transition is what we call related parties. And related parties can be family, as we find so common. Yes, there can be multi-generational family businesses that transition to the next generation. And I'd love to give some examples of that as we go on in this conversation. Because of my show, I've talked to some amazing families. And then the other category under related parties can be not related by blood, but related by the business, which would be management. And sometimes the transition is to management. Management might buy the business. They might work hand in hand with a private equity group that might be called a leverage buyout. Nonetheless, this is a group that has more insider information about the company, which can be less risky if you have a financial buyer looking at it and the management team is coming with it. That could be a really good thing. And then the third category of the types of buyers out there are strategic buyers. This is a really big category because it includes a company that might be a competitor to you. It might be in your supply chain or your value chain or ecosystem somehow. Maybe it's a customer of yours. And it could be geographic reasons why a competitor might want to acquire you. They want to gobble up market share in your geography, or they want to expand, or they just want to take someone out. And, I should mention too, it sort of falls under related parties. It's called an ESOP, which is an employee stock ownership plan. And it's a really tremendous opportunity for the right fit company. It's not for company has to be of a certain size, typically. Generally about $1.5 million to $2 million in EBITDA size in US dollars. And so what that means is, for an owner or a family selling, there's in the United States, there's tax benefits for that transaction. So that one is really interesting. Again, not for every company, but it's a way to enhance the ownership potential for not only saving taxes and in terms of the exchange, but also in the future when the company might have a second bite at the apple, for the family to regain more ownership stake. And again, extreme tax benefits are a big reason why companies go down that path. So that sort of falls under, again, the related parties, but it's like a special category.
So I know that there are some big companies, like we know, like Whole Foods, that got bought, and sometimes they have this initial mission. And a lot of our listeners, leaders of transformation, we're talking about transformation, we're talking about making a difference, disrupting for good, all of that. And a lot of these companies, they find themselves in a position to be bought out, and or merged with a larger entity or whatever, and they find themselves losing the essence of what made them great in the first place. And so as a owner or a founder, deciding which is going to be the right next step, what are some of the things that they need to take into consideration? Because, when you're courting, I mean, everything sounds good and you got numbers, big numbers are being thrown around, and it's very exciting, to think, wow, somebody's going to pay me that much for this company, or I'm going to make this much money, in however, options and so forth, that kind of thing. But like, really, if we're talking about surviving to the next generation, right, there's some things that they need to take into consideration when they're deciding which avenue to go, or considering the options that are now being presented to them.
That's a great point. Absolutely. That's where I like to start the conversations with my clients, is really trying to understand what their goals are from a big picture standpoint. And let's just perhaps just stay in the lower middle market, because that's even maybe for your audience, it's something we can all relate to, where perhaps these are businesses that are under 20 million in revenue. If we talk about companies 100 million, 50 million and larger, the heuristic that we see is that a company that's going to acquire you is typically at least five times larger than you in revenue. So the larger a company gets, the larger the acquirer is going to be. And then most likely you're going to get absorbed into the big company. I mean, let's just face it, they're acquiring you. So I think that is a dynamic that is interesting for this lower middle market, the smaller companies that have a company culture that's really important to them. They may want to maintain the name on the door type of culture where it does have that family feeling. But there is the reality of, when you sell your business, you're not going to be sponsoring the baseball teams anymore. I spoke to a fourth generation owner. His brother was running the business, and he was a shareholder, but there were various shareholders. It wasn't only his decision to sell. And after the sale, it was sad. It was depressing. It was a change for him that he wasn't really ready for. And that is a dynamic people have to realize, that when you do sell your business, if the family at closing might be out completely. That was my experience with the third generation company that I worked for. When we sold, the family had left on the day of close. That was part of the transaction agreement. And no doubt about it, the big company had absorbed us and integrated over time and made it their own. That will happen. And if you find that culture and maintaining the culture is such an important factor, then it might lead you towards one of the three directions I mentioned, the related parties direction, which is really trying to groom the next generation of family, or finding a management member that wants to have an ownership stake. And there can be hybrid solutions where maybe you recapitalize and there's some third-party funding from a private equity group, but it's a minority stake. Or it could be majority. But again, from a board control standpoint, I think that's really where the rubber meets the road on decision making. And ESOP for larger companies that choose that path is one reason that they're taking chips off the table to diversify their ownership stake. But at the same time, it's still, and so the owners, so to speak, is more diversified, but employees feel part of the ownership. They are part of the ownership structure, and that has the benefits carrying forward from a culture standpoint. A strategic, especially if it's a competitor, wow, really different cultures. And we see this, I've talked about it on my show a couple times, when competitive sales teams have to come together, and that can be very, very challenging.
Yeah.
So it really, again, comes down to what the board, what the ownership stakeholder, who the owners are, what their goals are, what they're trying to accomplish, because there are different mechanisms to accomplish different goals. And we do hear stories. I've talked about this with a few folks, that they didn't go with the highest bidder. It wasn't only about the money. They chose the acquirer because the acquirer was more of a right fit. And I've talked to some folks where they were the acquirer. The one, I think it was one of my earliest episodes. It might've been episode 3 with Chris Sinkar. He's a great guy. And when he was he must've been at the time in his 30s, and he bought a business from a gentleman who was roughly his father's age. They weren't related, but it almost felt like a father-son relationship. And the owner likewise felt that about him because he had a son, but the son didn't want to be part of his printing company. And so they found each other as just the right fit because generational difference aside, they had the same ethos. They wanted to maintain the same culture of the business, and the transition went very, very well.
Yeah, and I find a lot of times, and I've noticed with my clients as well, they want their kids to be in the business and to take on the reins, but not all the time do kids, and actually most times they don't. And so to convince them to do that when they're not, their heart's not really there is detrimental. It's not fair to them ultimately to expect them to carry on your legacy in that specific way, in that specific business model. But sometimes it can work really well, and I've seen that as well. Let's talk about business value, because I know that's a big question. It's like, how do I value my business? Where would I even start with that? Maybe if somebody's even looking down the road, one day I want to sell my business. What do they need to be putting in place now? So kind of unpack that, where it makes sense to start in terms of valuation, and whether it's, we can talk about also then increasing the value, and maybe what some of the things that decrease the value, so that we can really understand where to go from here.
Yeah, some people think that they know the value of their business because they talked to someone on the golf course and that person sold a similar company and they got such and such valuation for it. And therefore I can extrapolate and think about that, value on my company. And a lot of the language you might hear is, oh, so-and-so got a 4x multiple or a 3x multiple. So once you understand the math, then you know to say, well, multiple of what? Mm-hmm. And in this lower middle market, it is about profitability. And the number we often look at for an apples and apples consideration is EBITDA, earnings before interest, depreciation, tax, and amortization. And in a small company where the owner is having a lot more latitude about discretionary expenses, perhaps there are decisions that would be made differently by a different owner. And so the first thing that I do when someone wants to get a business valuation, I was just working on one this morning, and I look at 4 documents to start. Those 4 things are the last 3 years of tax returns and the most current year. If it's the tax return's not ready, then I'll look at their P&L statement. So with those 4 years, I normalize the expenses. So I go through everything. I'm looking at the revenues. I'll even normalize extraordinary revenue. So PPP revenue, or income, I should say, is not counted. We wouldn't count that towards their top line. And then likewise, if they have perhaps a couple of categories just to share, the owner compensation, we take that out, because if there's a new owner coming in, they're going to add back that number that fits them, right? So we take out certain expenses, and then we show what those are. And then when a new owner is going to do their cash flow estimate, they're going to do what we call add backs. So we take out these expenses and then reflect what they are, and non-cash things, right? We're not looking at interest. We're not looking at depreciation. And also, travel is an example, or gifts, any personal expenses that have run through the business. This can be really tricky for some companies that maybe don't want to spotlight what they've been running through the company. But the reality is how your business will be valued. It starts with the financials. So if you don't have clean financials, that's absolutely where it should start. And even before you come to talk to somebody like me, you want to get your financial house in order, because that's the number one thing I'm going to tell you. And it's hard. And yes, I could work with you and be your advisor and help you through that, but you're going to want to have some accounting support. Or if you want to use QuickBooks, that's totally fine. The more sophisticated, I'm not saying everybody has to have a financial audit, and a $30,000 annual expense on that. That's not necessary, but well organized, well categorized, so that when it comes time to sit down and look at the numbers, it's easy to make sense of it. That's the first thing, first and foremost, Nicole, is the financial, how clean they are. And from there, I take all of that, I put it in my magic black box of software that I have and lay it all out in my Excel spreadsheets. And then I also do a market comp analysis based on the industry and the size of the business. And just like if you're buying a house, you want to look at the comps in that neighborhood. But we know there's differences inside the house and outside. And that's the other part of what I do is I use a business assessment tool called the Value Builder system. And it's great, especially when it's a new relationship, to get to know the client and get to know their business. And in this value assessment, I'm also able to point out to them what factors in their business might be causing a lower value or might show potential for a higher value. And so we can dive in on what those 8 value drivers are if you want.
Yeah, I would like to do that actually, and talk about some of the things that increase and decrease value, because those are the things that some people oftentimes will say, well, I hadn't thought of that, and if they can plan ahead for that, prepare before they go talking to you, then they're that much further ahead and ready for a potential valuation and sale.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the first category is the one we've been talking about, which is the financials. So what are the financials of the business? What has the trending been over the last 3-4 years? How can changes be explained, such as what's happened over, 2020? There's conversation about the numbers and how clean they are and reporting. The other thing I want to mention in this particular aspect is size. Smaller companies, let's say under 5 million, especially in revenue, are considered more risky because they tend to be owner-led, owner-managed, owner-run. And if we unpack that a little bit, what does that mean? Well, if the business isn't transferable to a new owner, then it has more risk associated with it, which means the owner is the buyer, let's say the new buyer, as they evaluate the business, are going to put more of a discount factor on it, which means a lower valuation to you. Because
it's like the owner is the magic, and you take the magic out of the business, and maybe people don't
what's
really
left?
want to, they don't really want to do business with somebody else because they've actually built this tight relationship with the owner, which is great when the owner's running the business, but it doesn't actually help for the sale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One extreme example, just taking it for fun, and be, let's talk about Michael Jackson. I mean, Michael Jackson was the star, right? But Michael Jackson created a catalog of music, and that catalog of music has lasting value. So apply that same thought to a company, right? What is that lasting value that the company will generate? So the next category we call growth potential. How much field is left to plow? So if you are dominating your category and you have 90% market share, there's not much left for the potential buyer to grow. If you have 10% market share and you can show that there's all this potential in your geography or your specific category, that represents a lot of growth ideas for the acquirer. So growth potential is really important, which then leads to, well, what makes you special, right? What makes you special? What's the secret sauce? What's the differentiation? Warren Buffett talks about having a competitive moat around your business, and that differentiation, the niche that you occupy, creates more value. Why? Because it's hard to replicate. So one thing I think we need to realize is it's not just about the conversations that they're having with you in the room. It's the conversations they're having about you when you're not in the room. And especially if you are a product or a service company that could be replicated, that's the conversation. Can they replicate your business, and what will it cost them to do that? And if it's difficult to replicate or too costly, then it could point to, yes, acquire, right? And so for strategics and for financial, well, probably more strategics than financial, but that could still happen in the financial setting because they might have other portfolio companies that could do that replication. But these all start to tie together. But again, this differentiation is so important, which leads to the next one, which is really fun, actually, if you think about it, recurring revenue. If you have a recurring revenue business that has more than 40% or 40% or higher of your total revenue is recurring, which is different from reoccurring. Recurring means it's contracted, that your client has to end the contract with you. You put in your credit card for Netflix, what happens? They charge you every year, every month. and the software so that's a recurring revenue business, which adds to your valuation. Why? Well, because the acquirers want a predictable flow of future cash, right? That's what they're looking at. What is the cash flow of this business? What's the working capital needs of the business? And especially if they're taking on debt, is that debt serviceable from the cash flow? And a recurring revenue business is more predictable because, again, you have a sense of what's coming. Now, you'll have churn, and we want to minimize the churn, the number of people that are leaving you, but you're bringing in new customers, and it's like the bathtub, right? The in and the out. So I love this topic because there's a lot of companies that are probably listening thinking, oh man, I don't have a product that I sell on a regular basis, or gee, my service doesn't lend itself to that nature. Well, it might. And I love working with clients on that. How can we create more of a recurring revenue model in your business? And there's all different types of models. There's 9 or so. So we won't go into detail here, but that's a good follow-up if people want to talk to me about that. How can we productize your service? And there's a few other categories, but I'll take a breath. I mean, there's there's 8 value drivers, and we've talked through a few of them, and I can speed through the remainder if you want.
Well, before you do that, I think it's relevant to go back to something you just said. When you talk about strategics, perhaps buying the business or considering whether or not it's replicatable, I think there's a fear there that if I entertain a potential buyer and we enter into discussions, they're going to learn about my business. They're going to learn about all these details, and then they're going to determine whether or not they're going to replicate it, which has certainly happened. So how do they protect themselves? Can they protect themselves from somebody coming in and saying, oh, yes, I'm seriously interested in buying this business, and then turning around and actually replicating the business instead?
Yeah, that is a fear, and I understand it completely. I work with clients on both buy side and sell side transactions as an M&A intermediary. I have a designation from as a certified M&A advisor. And one of the clients I have right now is selling their family business. He's second generation, and he recognizes that the best possible acquirer is a competitor. He knows that. And we set out from the very beginning knowing that when we put together the materials to market his business, he knows that competitors will be seeing it. Here's what they won't see. And if you're selling your company, this is, something that anybody should sort of heed the warning here. If you have highly confidential information, which might include your software code, your customer list, the names of your customers, literally the names of your employees, those are not things you want to reveal early on in the discussions. Due diligence does happen before a deal is signed, but that doesn't mean that the most confidential things aren't, you want to turn those over once the deal is signed. So you can stipulate, hey, I'll give you this document, but it's going to be redacted. The customer names are redacted. Right. And those are the types of things you can aggregate data. So another company I'm selling, they prospective buyer wanted to know what zip codes that the current service business, occupies. And so I aggregated that. I didn't give addresses. I didn't give specifics. And that was sufficient to answer his question. So you have to, working with an advisor like somebody like me, that's a service that we're providing. We're fielding all these questions, and we're savvy to know, they're looking for more answers to help them determine what the business value is going to be and the value to them. But that doesn't mean you have to give away all the confidential information. And you do take some risk in exposing, other aspects of your business to a competitor. There's no question about that. I have a client, he was in discussions with a potential acquirer that was a competitor, and we didn't get past the NDA, frankly. He just couldn't stomach it. He said, I just can't move forward with them. I don't trust them. And that's going to happen, and that's okay. You have to kind of know what your boundaries are. And that's, I think, a part of the value of having an intermediary is to help buffer some of the emotional things, but also to protect you and your interests.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you talked about some more value builders. You want to just kind of quickly run through them? Yeah.
We'll cruise through the remainder of these. So the other thing is, we talk about different types of capital. You have the capital you've built in your business from the product or service standpoint. You have the customer relationships, which represents capital also. And so the value of your database might be one of the assets that you have. How do we measure that? Well, if you're a service business, we look at churn, we're looking at cost of acquisition. So we want to have those measurements, those KPIs. We also might measure customer satisfaction. A lot of times, and especially comes out in the survey, if we're not quantifying it, it's very anecdotal. You might get complaints to your website, but if you are measuring and you're using something like the Net Promoter Score, which is a widely adopted measure, and we've all answered this question, how likely are you to recommend? That's a objective number that, particularly in the from a financial buyer, the private equity firms out there are very comfortable with that type of measure, and they might be looking for that. The other really big category has to do with risk. And it's risk around, so we talked about risk around the size of the business, the transferability. So that owner is so centered to this. We call this the hub and spoke challenge. The hub and spoke, meaning the owner's in the center, that person, everyone runs to them, solve problems, visionary. They have relationships with the customer, perhaps they're the largest rainmaker, salesperson in the company. Well, what happens if that person is sick? We ask the question in this assessment that I give is, well, how many hours a week are you working? So are we going to have a health burnout that can present risk? But also, if you haven't taken a vacation, right? And what happens if you're not in your company for 90 days? Will that company stagnate? Will it be fine? Thinking about your key employees, what happens if they leave your business? So if you're leaving upon close and you're not staying with the acquirer, and we can talk about that too, what that looks like sometimes when you do stay, but let's assume you're not, you're going to go off and you're going to do amazing things. You're going to go different things. Well, what about your second in command? Are they going to stay on? Are they going to leave? And if you don't have a management team that's going to go with the business, again, represents a lot of risk. So the third category of risk is your supplier base. Imagine you've built a business on Facebook, and we're seeing what's happening with Facebook now, right? Apple made a change, which changed the advertising parameters, which plummeted some of their revenue, which impacted their stock. Well, what happens to your business if Apple makes another decision or Facebook makes a decision and you don't have your own website, it's on Facebook? That represents a lot of risk, doesn't it? Sometimes things out of our control present risk to us. It can be your contracts that you've signed, these are within your control. So we have a mix of things that we want to really understand in the transferability of that business. And then, that's kind of the synopsis. I think you take all those things and you look at it of where are they on their own on a scale of 0 to 100? And also then where are they versus their peer group by the industry they're in? And that's the conversation that I have with folks, which is a really great assessment. It's a great way to look at the business. And if they've hired me to do a business valuation, I put these together for them so they can get a picture of what risks are in the business today, what some of their strengths are. And then we work on a plan for how do we reduce those risks and capitalize on those opportunities.
Awesome. I listen to you and you're so articulate, and obviously you know your stuff. I'm just curious, how did you get into this business and, make this because there's a lot of things you could be passionate about in this space of business, but this in particular has become your focal point. So maybe give us a little bit of the backstory of how you actually got here.
Yeah, I think in my career, I've had a number of business transitions, and I'm somebody who's always been comfortable with change and advising people at times when they're dealing with change. Friends have always reached out to me when they're having issues or trouble or thinking through things. One of my friends calls me her Moses. And I think this really started, I would say, about 5-6 years ago when I was going through the M&A experience at that company that was bought out, and being part of the management team, going through the pre-diligence. We on our end were the ones getting acquired. So we needed to put everything together. We needed to sell ourselves as the management team, how we would be adding value to the acquirer, and then going through the integration process. And then when it was time to leave and move on, I worked for a private equity group, and then I was on the other side of the table doing deals. And so this mergers and acquisitions space was really interesting to me because it's at the C-suite level, but it's using my marketing brain in a different way and my analytical brain. 25 plus years in marketing comes to bear when I am marketing companies for sale and I have to help package and do the business development and the outreach. So a lot of the skills I think that I've developed throughout my career in the C-suite, but then the desire to be an entrepreneur and work with entrepreneurs, I've always orbited the entrepreneurial space, from startups to big companies and everything in between. And for companies that want to continue in their baton to families, I was part of that third generation company that sold, and so inspired by their family story, so inspired by the innovation that company had created over 3 generations, and then benefited when it was eventually, handed off to another entity. And I really like family businesses. I think that they're very exciting. I talked to a lot of them on my show. The oldest generational one was 10th generation.
Wow.
I kid you not. One of their original customers was George Washington. Like,
wow, what kind of business? What kind of business?
Applejack brandy.
Wow.
Yeah. And so they're fascinating stories, and they're, it's business, but it's family, and you have emotion and it's fun. So that's one of the things that really drives me. I think it's the business side, but it's the emotional side. And just I'm a deal junkie at heart, and I really like the chase of the buy side, sell side, and bringing it all together.
Wow. I just think 10 generations. I mean, you imagine the legacy. I imagine if the person who started that business ever dreamed that business would last 10 generations, and we talk about transformation is, you like change, transformation is changing one thing into the next, but there is like a golden thread of perhaps it's a brand reputation or something that is continuing through this process. I think of the term, I always say to clients, principles never change, but methods do. So if you have this golden thread that consistently stays, it's your brand promise, it's your reputation, let's say, and then throughout generations as things are changing. I mean, how much has business changed in that long amount of time? It's like everything's changed in the way that it's being done. But what did you notice even from that one, what they did that was the sustaining piece and what was the transformative piece? I think that'd be a great place to kind of finish off as a real life example.
That company, it's called Laird and Company. It was episode 34. And I spoke with generation 10 and 9. So it was a mother and son. And what seemed very consistent throughout that company's history was the commitment to the product. And the Applejack brandy recipe has pretty much stayed the same since, 1760s. And then they've, over the more recent years, because I did want to talk to them about what continues them forward, and talking to generation 10, he's in his 20s, I think. And so for him, he's trying to help them innovate. And COVID was so hard for them because they sell to bars, and what happened with bars, the bars had, couldn't do in-person events, in on-premise serving. And it was very, very difficult. So they're mission driven to support the industry. They created some nonprofit fundraising and things like that. But the innovation for them, I think, is coming in terms of how they're marketing their product and the relationships that they're building with bartenders, and how those bartenders are becoming curative of recipes. And there's trends that they follow and waxes and wanes through, decades and hundreds of years for that particular product taste change. And they recognize that, but I think they try to stay very close to the customer. So I was really impressed by their market knowledge and the role they play in the industry as a long time, very high quality reputation company.
And so what would you be doing for a company like that as an example? Because they're planning to continue on with, next generation transition, but staying within the family. What would you do for a company like that? Well,
with a company like that, and they're not a client of mine, to be clear, but if they were, and they wanted to work on, they were just on my show, but if they wanted to work on an innovation project, I work with clients on innovation ideas. So it's a great example when you have a multi-generational business or a very mature company that is in the company life cycle. Maybe they're hitting that other side, they're coming down the other side towards what Itzhak Adizes calls the fall. The fall is not a great place to be, but it is possible to move back to what we call prime, which is the other side of that hill. And prime is ideal. It's when your culture is humming. It's when products and services are at their peak and everything's clicking. But we all know that's hard to get to. So somebody like me who has, a lot of 25 plus years of experience and ultimately can help them with figuring out what innovation makes sense to them. I'm also an adjunct professor at Carnegie Mellon in this space, which is a corporate entrepreneurship space, and meaning large companies can be innovative too. And so a lot of times it's about bringing the process forward. So that I would say is more consultative. It doesn't have to do with selling, right? But it's more about how do we build value and how do we take this company to the next level in terms of their vision and future. A great episode on my show was a conversation with Ken Jansen. He's the Generation 4 CEO of Highlights Magazine. It's very inspiring. This is a company that's very mission driven. And we had a great conversation about innovation in a mature company. And he gave a lot of great examples of what they're doing.
Awesome. Well, Laurie, thank you so much it's been very informative. I've learned a lot, and I know our listeners have as well, because, obviously you're very skilled in what you're doing and passionate about it. And I love that. And you've got a wonderful resource in your podcast where people can go and listen to that. So that's Succession Stories podcast. We'll make sure that's in the links in the show notes, I should say. And where else can people reach you?
If people want to get in touch, there's a couple of different places. I like to be where you are. So one is on LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect and talk to you. The other is if you want to hit me up on my website, check it out, learn more. The URL is smalldotbig.com, smalldotbig.com. And you'll find my podcast there, and you'll find resources that you can learn about the Value Builder system, and the assessment that I mentioned is available to you on that website. But if you want to just, jump to in Monopoly, just, jump to home base, meetlaurie.barkman.com is a really easy way to schedule some time to meet with me. I give complimentary advisory sessions. So I'll meet with you and we can schedule your business assessment, and I'll go through the results with you all at no charge.
Beautiful. Again, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's been great to have you here. And I look forward to continue the conversation on your podcast very soon.
Me too. Thanks so much, Nicole.
My pleasure. And thank you to our listeners for being here and our viewers. I hope you've enjoyed this and again, really gotten some information out of this. I think about, what I say oftentimes is leaders of transformation take action. You can listen to podcasts all day and gather all this information, but it's only when you take action on it, when you begin to apply it to your own situation, that's where the transformation begins to happen. And so I would encourage you today is to take action on something that you learned. Maybe it is looking at your business, evaluating your business for yourself and just saying, like, where am I strong? Where are we strong? Where are we not so strong? Where, go and listen to Laurie's podcast, learn more about what she's doing. Go to her website, smalldotbig.com, and you can find out some of those value builders and saying, where do I need to add value? Where maybe are we putting ourselves in a position to actually have value depreciation happening? Just really looking at what you've got to work with. Where do I have systems in place? Am I the magic in the business? Or is there something else that will actually sustain long after I'm gone? Start asking yourself these quality questions so that you can start to move forward and prepare your business for a future sale. Or I know some people that I've had on this show, even they say, I don't have any intention of ever selling my business off to someone else, but they do have a vision of taking their brand and passing it on to the next generation in their family. Either way, the business needs to be set up to be sustainable into that and through that next generation and onwards. So I encourage you to take action on it. We'd love to hear your stories. You can, of course, go on leadersoftransformation.com and you can reach out to us. We'd love to hear how this is impacting you and even what you're doing to make a difference in the world. We'd love to hear from you. You can also find us, of course, on social. And we just love to showcase great stories of people that are leading transformation in their respective arena. So with that, thank you again for being here. And we look forward to seeing you next week. We have another amazing guest. They'll be on the show, a leader of transformation. And we'll look forward to having you join us there. Have a great day.